Glenn, I suggest that you start your presentation and I'll follow up with a lot of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for having me at the event today. It's a real privilege to be here with you. Okay, let's begin. So the title is Rethinking Transport Planning for a Changing World. And this is a personal journey that I've been on, I suppose, for my whole career, but particularly over the last 8 to 10 years or so, in relation to dealing with uncertainty, but also trying to make more sense of the system itself that we are trying to plan for and positively influence for the future. And I'm emphasizing here rethinking, which may not seem terribly applied and pragmatic, and you may be thinking, oh dear, we have an academic presenting to us yet again. But actually, I believe more and more that there's a fundamentally important philosophical stance we now need to take in our approach to transport planning and indeed to strategic planning more generally in society, in a society which, even before COVID and the myriad of shocks that we seem to be reverberating from, was in a significant state of flux, as I'll come on to. Right, let me move onwards. So what I'll cover in the presentation are 4 elements. First of all, and it may or may not be so surprising to you now, but it's been my belief for some years that we are in the midst of a fundamental regime change in society. We're moving from a very stable way of the world that we once knew for some decades, the world of automobility, towards a very different type of transport and society, a new regime. And in this sense, it's not just that we're moving beyond automobility in terms of transport and society, but actually in turn, we need to, and I believe we're starting to move beyond forecast-led planning. The next section is turning our attention to the system that we all live in and gain access through, which is the triple access system. It's not simply the transport system. And so the importance, coming back to this philosophical standpoint, the importance of us moving beyond a mobility mindset when we're looking at our planning function. I'll then move on to setting out what we have been developing and now applying for some years, a new approach to planning, which we call decide and provide rather than predict and provide, which has triple access planning integral to it. And this is about being vision-led and accommodating the uncertainty that now surrounds us as we look, well, even in the present, but looking to the future. And then I'll conclude with just a brief look ahead and the importance of us taking a more robust approach to planning for the future. Instead of, I would suggest, kidding ourselves in the present, that we can still use our various analytical tools to get some sense of precision about what lies ahead in the future. So the notion of regime transition, this slide just depicts an accumulation over the last 2 decades and more of the various digital age developments that many parts of society, not all of course, we know that barely half the world's population has internet access in spite of many countries presuming it's now a taken as given norm. But over those years, we've seen society absorb a succession of digital age developments, such that going back to a vantage point of 1989, when the web was invented, and looking forwards right through to present day and this COVID-infected world in which many of us have been living much more digitally oriented lives, how much has changed, and could we really have imagined back in the late 1980s and 1990s that this sort of change would unfold ahead of us? And in essence, what we've seen is the digital age colliding and merging with the motor age. And I believe it's this sense of being in transition that explains significantly why we're feeling a deep sense of uncertainty. Now, this slide, you can focus in on any one of the 6 graphs. They all tell a similar story, but it's offering some empirical insight to the proposition that we are in transition. as many of you will know, transport planning has been firmly founded upon a belief that there's a strong coupling between economic output and traffic output. And it's led to the presumption almost of an unstated law of transport planning, which is you can't have economic growth without traffic growth. And since all governments would wish to see economic prosperity, they are keen to make sure they don't inhibit the opportunities for traffic growth in the sense that that supports economic prosperity. But what these graphs are showing, so the fine dotted line shows economic output as GDP, and then the solid line shows vehicle kilometers traveled. So this is road kilometers. And what you can see in several countries is since the 1990s, when we really saw the arrival of the internet, and that's the thick dotted line is showing the penetration of internet access into these societies. What we see is a decoupling between economic output and road traffic. In other words, it's possible to have greater economic prosperity without coming at the cost of more motorized traffic filling our towns, cities, and interurban corridors. Meanwhile, in the world of transport planning, analysis, and forecasting, the hedgehog diagram has come to the fore, originally conceived of by Professor Phil Goodwin. This may be familiar to you, but what it highlights is that over successive forecasting exercises, our forecasts still point towards that presumption of increasing traffic levels, in spite of the fact that as we measure out-turn traffic levels, they never reach the level of expectation indicated by the forecasts themselves. And yet we seem somehow to stubbornly persist in looking for forecasts and producing forecasts that insist that this actual line should be moving upwards to align with the forecasts. Of course, this is posing big questions for us now about how we plan our future. And indeed, to focus on the UK Department for Transport, going back some years now to 2015, before Brexit, before COVID, before geopolitical instability, before so many changes that we've seen over recent years, even then the department was recognizing a significant degree of uncertainty that underlies its attempts at road traffic forecasting. There's uncertainty in the key inputs, things like population, income, and fuel price. There's uncertainty in the relationships between the inputs and out-turn traffic demand. And indeed, there are new factors coming in, perhaps related to this transitional effect that society is in, which are influencing travel behavior itself. And therefore, forecasting future travel demand is a fool's errand, as the famous Chinese philosopher from many hundreds of years ago pointed out. Those who have knowledge don't predict, and those who predict don't have knowledge. Fast forward to 2018, again, still before the shocks that the world has seen in terms of the pandemic and subsequently, but the UK Department for Transport was moving further away from any notion that it could have confidence in a most likely future forecast. So instead of a central projection around which it did sensitivity testing, it now explicitly acknowledged that its forecasts reflected a set of scenarios, a set of plausible futures. And indeed, underlined by the quote here, that while uncertainty in road traffic demand has always existed, it's perhaps now more uncertain than ever. And this poses a fundamental challenge to orthodox transport planning, which has been based, as you will perhaps know, on the idea that we forecast a do-nothing future before we make any interventions. And then we consider a particular transport scheme or intervention and look at the effect of that intervention on the system. And then we can identify the benefits that we accrue from that intervention and weigh those up against the costs of delivering the intervention. But suppose there is no single do-nothing future, given the uncertainty we face. If there are multiple do-nothing futures, the question moves to which of those should we build a business case on for our transport planning policy and investment. But let's now move to the system itself that we're planning for, because it never was simply the transport system that our planning was affected. When I founded the Centre for Transport and Society nearly 20 years ago, a key premise of our interest as our research centre was recognising that transport never only served society, transport shapes society, just as society in turn shapes transport. But we do know that travel is a derived demand. That's almost the first rule of transport planning that one learns. It's derived from our need to access people, goods, services, and opportunities. And yet it doesn't have to be like this Thanksgiving image from Los Angeles in West Coast America, where we've allowed a particular way of fulfilling access requirements to perpetuate a growing dependence on mobility as a means of access. And it is about access, as opposed to the phrase, it's about the economy, stupid. In this instance, it's about access, stupid. Transport problems don't only need transport solutions, in spite of the fact that so often it appears that that's how we're going about trying to provide an improvement to the system of the future. And the key thing to recognize, building upon the notion of transition, is that the forms of access in society are changing, and they will change. And most importantly, therefore, as a sense of dynamic, they can be changed in future. That's the role of planning, or at least strong vision-led planning. So this, having made reference already to the triple access system, in essence, is what I'm referring to. It's the simplest of models representing the world we live in. So at the heart of the model is our wish to gain access to people, goods, jobs, services, and opportunities. And we can do that, of course, through use of the transport system and physical mobility. But also, as has always been the case, the land use system, particularly with good urban planning, can allow us access through spatial proximity. And therein lies the notion of agglomeration, where we are very proximate to those things that we need to access, thereby not needing to rely on motorized mobility as much. But over the last 20 years, we've seen this rapidly matured telecommunications system that now provides, if you like, the third leg of the triple access stool in the form of digital connectivity. And of course, these three subsystems are all interrelated to one another, creating our overall experience of triple access in society. And what I would suggest to you is that if this is entirely new, the concept of triple access, or perhaps even that you've done little to examine land use transport interactions, in effect, what one's been allowing to happen is uncertainty to come into our transport analysis, because plainly, if we ignore two of the three subsystems that are actually determining how we go about our lives in society, we're simply inviting more uncertainty into our analysis of the transport system alone. So let's just look briefly, albeit conceptually, at how this triple access system has been changing over very recent years. If we go to a pre-pandemic point, then perhaps you'll recognize this sense that we've relied very heavily on the physical mobility forms of access from the transport system, with less dependence perhaps on spatial proximity and digital connectivity. But as we see the pandemic come upon the world, many of us, not all of us of course, but many of us saw that we first of all had the capacity to adapt as individuals. And we shifted from a reliance on physical mobility to a much greater reliance on digital connectivity, coupled with spending more time in our local neighborhoods, giving rise to the notion of living local and acting global. The question, of course, becomes how might the shape of this triple access system and how we use it change in future? And therefore, how can we help change that system in terms of supply side influence that supports different forms of fulfilling access in the future? And what we have recognized, as well as the adaptive capacity of human behavior during the course of the pandemic, but also, thank goodness, we live in a triple access system, because it's that which has provided us with the resilience in society to continue to function economically and socially, thanks to this set of multiple forms of access at our disposal. Now, you may be thinking at this point, this sounds very complicated. How on earth are we going to measure and model all of this, given the complexity of our existing transport models? And to some extent, I would say, hold on, please don't consider going too quickly down that route. This is really a model which is helping us to think differently. I come back to that philosophical standpoint about how we make sense of future mobility and how we plan for it. And in very simple terms, perhaps allied to Maslow's hierarchy of need, you will perhaps have heard the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail. Well, here I would suggest that failing to think about what we're planning for and how to plan is also planning to fail. So please don't underestimate how important it is to stand back and really understand the standpoint you have, the outlook that you're introducing to the system you're trying to plan for and influence. That's an important determinant of how and why we plan and the consequences that arise. At this point, a quick promotional place in the presentation to mention a pan-European project that I have the privilege of being part of, working with the Urban Planning Institute in Slovenia. The project is called Triple Access Planning for Uncertain Futures. And we're very much trying to understand more deeply how we can think differently about the planning approach to urban mobility and thereby enhance sustainable urban mobility planning across Europe. But I would put the health warning, as you see on this slide, that triple access planning, as we're calling it, is not about simplifying the strategic transport planning approach, but instead trying to improve its fitness for purpose. Something we've spent the early months of the project exploring together from a range of perspectives and developing is our mental model of the triple access system. And if you pause for thought, you'll recognize that each and every one of us as professionals has a mental model of the system, whether it's simply the transport system or this wider triple access system, of how all the different variables or factors interact and influence one another to create the dynamics that we see around us in everyday life and in the mobility system. And it can be very helpful to undergo an exercise with colleagues of systems thinking, to develop a mental model like this, to better appreciate the sorts of factors that are at play, and therefore when one's considering policy options and interventions as part of sustainable urban mobility planning, to have a better idea about developing those options in full awareness of how they fit into this systems model. So why would it be a good idea, if you're not already engaged in looking at changing the approach to urban mobility planning, to consider doing so now? Well, I think there are a series of factors which bode well for us taking a new approach to transport planning now. The first is that we have a really strong imperative beyond some of the other shocks I've mentioned, of course, is the climate emergency. We can't forecast more traffic growth, more motorization, and therefore with the implication that that could mean more emissions. We're in a situation where that has to change. We do now have a sufficiently compelling offer in the form of this triple rather than double access system. And has been suggested by others, if we don't allow ourselves to be drawn into trying to measure and model this to a high level of detail, but instead see it as a means of thinking differently about the system, then we can harness the opportunity here. The psyche, what's been a silver lining perhaps of the pandemic, is that it's exposed all of us, both as professionals and as members of the public, and politicians, to appreciating how we are able to adapt within a triple access system in changing our lived experience every day. And we do have a way of applying this new approach, which I'll come on to. So decide and provide, in essence, is about deciding on a preferred accessibility future and related outcomes, and then providing a means to move towards that in a way that accommodates the deep uncertainty ahead. You can contrast it, and of course I'm highly simplifying here, but you can contrast decide and provide with traditional predict and provide as follows. So instead of forecasting a most likely mobility future, this is about deciding on a preferred accessibility future. Rather than being the demand-led supply of predict and provide, decide and provide is about supply-led demand, shaping the system in a way that encourages and influences patterns of demand that seem more appropriate. While predict and provide conceals uncertainty, decide and provide is about accommodating uncertainty. And in that sense, it's more proactive than reactive. And as the slide says, will you join the innovators? Because this has moved now beyond simply academic theory and speculation to being applied by different transport and urban authorities. Here's an example, in fact, from a national government in Scotland in the UK. Not only have they committed to achieving net zero by 2045, which is in itself a fundamental form of vision-led planning, that's its decision, but in turn, it's decided recently that it will aim to achieve a 20% reduction in total car kilometers by 2030 against pre-pandemic levels. And published earlier this year is its route map to achieving that vision. This is the provide part of decide and provide. So just one example showing you that it is out there being applied now. It's moved beyond the realms of theory. I have the privilege of not only being in academia, but working for a transport consultancy, Mott MacDonald. And between those two organizations, I took a lead in developing a 6-stage approach to strategic planning, which we called futures, which is a way of implementing decide and provide. The 6 stages you can see on screen here. Very briefly, the first stage is about trying to open people's minds back to this point of a way of thinking, to be ready to engage in a different approach to planning. Stage 2 is about preferred futures. This is concerned very much with being vision-led. Stage 3 is then about exposing the uncertainty into which our future investments and policies are playing, and being able to accommodate and understand that uncertainty. Stage 4 is the option development, which we're perhaps all familiar with when we develop our plans and strategies. And then critically, stage 5 is closing down, where one tries to make sense of how, from a different set of options, the best options can be identified, i.e. those which can best accommodate the uncertainty ahead of us, which we can't control, and still help deliver our preferred future. And the last stage is a reminder that this can never be a one-off exercise in a changing world, but really should be an adaptive process of continuously monitoring, reviewing, and refining our approaches in an adaptive way. Here's just one example. It's conceptual in the sense that it combines different elements, but you could imagine this being a triple access based vision. So we take the example from Scotland of the reduction in car kilometers as the physical mobility dimension. In Wales in the UK, there's a government commitment to 30% of its workforce now working regularly from home post-pandemic. So that very much addresses the digital connectivity part of the vision. And then we can take Mayor Hidalgo in Paris, where the 15-minute city is really being brought to life, and with great emphasis upon the importance of spatial proximity. And this type of conceptualizing, bringing these things together to create triple access visions for the future really is an opportunity for the taking there. I won't dwell on this slide in the interest of time, but this is just showing you again from our pan-European project how we've been developing a series of plausible or possible triple access futures for different European urban areas. This is not about saying which ones we prefer, but simply highlighting that beyond the control of the urban authorities, because of the different driving forces that are shaping society and forms of access, that we need to entertain and be able to accommodate some very different scenarios for the future. So how do we go about then making use of those scenarios in our planning itself? Well, imagine here we have 4 of those triple access scenarios for the future. And we also have our preferred triple access future for the urban area concerned. What we need to understand is what happens when we make a policy intervention in the near immediate future in terms of the effect that will have playing out over perhaps the next 15 to 20 or even 30 years over the lifespan of our urban mobility plan. And what we really need to see happen is that that policy intervention will exert influence in each of the futures that it may find itself existing in the future, such that those futures are orientated more towards the preferred future that we're setting about to shape in terms of our urban mobility planning. And in that sense, the closing down stage of this decide and provide approach is about taking our candidate policy options and asking, how would that policy option perform in different plausible futures? Would it help achieve good alignment with our vision? Is it going to result in very poor alignment and even policy failure? Or perhaps there's some uncertainty there in our own conviction about how it will align. And by looking at that, one can start to identify which the policy options appear to perform well across multiple futures, thereby suggesting, in least regrets terms, a more robust option for us to pursue, as opposed to those where we're seeing both ticks and crosses dependent upon the external changes in the world that are beyond our control. And so just to move to the finish with a look ahead, I think a real challenge facing us now, I mean, it does feel like a perfect storm, is that we're in a world that's in a state of flux, self-evidently from the news headlines we wake up to every morning. And in turn, I firmly believe that we need a different form of transport planning, a different form of urban mobility planning. But that presents significant challenges to us. If we're to be in transition as a profession, then there are a number of things which create inertia in the system we're currently in. People are very familiar with orthodox approaches. They may not have the resources or there may not be the direction or agency to do things differently. We're still strongly coloured by a rear view mentality of how we see the transport system. There are many unconscious biases at play, and of course, vested interests. Ironically, it may feel risky to contemplate a different approach to transport planning. And yet, I have to say, being risk averse right now may be the greatest risk we take. And we may need a different skills mix in transport or triple access planning. But I would encourage us all to think and believe now that it's time to bring constructive challenge to what we're comfortable with. And please don't be tempted, if you are a hammer wielder, as perhaps we all are, to treat everything as if it were a nail. We need new tools for building the future. And just a final slide before I hand back of, I hope, encouragement and reassurance that this is something being grappled with in terms of new approaches to planning. So the UK Department for Transport, particularly now for major scheme investments, will be expecting scheme promoters to test their scheme against a set of, in fact, it's now 7, what are called common analytical scenarios. So a scheme promoter will have to demonstrate value for money across 7 different futures in order to build that greater confidence that we are indeed making robust decisions in the face of an uncertain and changing world. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I